Pine Hollow, Wyoming Territory, 1885. Nash Whitlock had ridden out early that morning to check fence line. He hadn't expected to find a wagon overturned in a dry creek bed instead. An old woman lay burning with fever inside it. A young woman knelt beside her, too exhausted to do anything but hold her mother's hand and wait for whatever came next. He'd carried Eleanor Prescott into his own house without asking permission from anyone. There hadn't seemed to be a version of that morning where he did anything else. He'd spent the 4 days since, kneeling beside her bed more often than he stood anywhere else on his own ranch, offering water when she could take it, cool cloths when the fever climbed, patient with sickness in a way that comes only from having sat with it before, and knowing exactly how little a person could actually control once it took hold. Rosalind Prescott stood in the doorway that fourth evening, watching him hold a tin cup steady against her mother's lips, her hand pressed flat against her own chest, as though she could hold her heart in place by force if it tried to break free of her. "The fever's no better," she said, her voice thin with 4 days of no real sleep. "No," Nash agreed, not offering false comfort he didn't have any right to give. "But it's no worse either. That's something, some days, when it's all the body's got to hold on to." Rosalind looked at this stranger kneeling beside her dying mother with a patience he owed neither of them. Watching him, she knew she was about to do something considerably more desperate than she'd have believed herself capable of 3 days earlier. Eleanor and Rosalind Prescott had left Ohio that spring, 6 months after Eleanor's husband died, leaving debts nobody had known about until the creditors arrived within a week of the funeral, taking the house, the furniture, and most of what Rosalind had believed, right up until that terrible month, to be a stable and comfortable life. Rosalind had spent those 6 months learning piece by piece exactly how much of the comfort she'd grown up with had rested on debts her father had never once mentioned, kept quiet the way some men kept quiet about illness, hoping it might simply resolve itself before anyone else needed to know. A distant cousin in Oregon had written, offering room enough for both of them and work for Rosalind at the cousin's dry goods store, and Eleanor had insisted on making the journey despite her age, despite Rosalind's quiet worry that the trip itself might cost her mother more than the debts already had. They traveled by rail as far as the money allowed, then by hired wagon the rest of the way west, Eleanor growing friendlier with every rough mile, though she'd refused stubbornly to let Rosalind see how much the journey was costing her, insisting each evening that she was simply tired, nothing more, the same word doing more and more work as the weeks wore on. The wagon axle had broken 3 miles outside Pine Hollow, pitching them into a dry creek bed hard enough to bruise them both and strand them overnight before Nash found them. Eleanor had taken a chill in the night air that had settled by the second day into something considerably more dangerous than a simple cold, a fever that climbed and dropped and climbed again, a cough that rattled deep enough to frighten even the hired driver into leaving them behind rather than wait out whatever was coming, taking his fee and his wagon, and offering only a mumbled apology as he rode off toward the next town. Rosalind had nobody left in the world who could reach them faster than the letters would travel. Not the cousin in Oregon, still weeks away by any road available. Not any family back in Ohio, since her father's death had scattered what little extended family they'd once claimed. She had exactly the money in her pocket, her mother's failing health, and a stranger's ranch house that had, for reasons she still didn't fully understand, simply opened its door to both of them without asking what she could offer in return. Nash Whitlock was 33, had run his modest spread alone for 6 years, and had not hesitated for even a moment before carrying a stranger's dying mother into his own house, though he'd offered Rosalind no explanation for why beyond the plain fact that leaving her in an overturned wagon hadn't struck him as any kind of real option. He didn't tell her that first day that he'd watched his own mother die of a fever much like Eleanor's when he was 14, in a house too far from any doctor to matter, his father working the fields and unable to reach town in time even if there had been a doctor worth reaching. He remembered with a clarity that had never once dulled across 19 years the exact sound his mother's breathing had made in the final hours and had recognized that same rattling breath in Eleanor's chest the moment he lifted her from the overturned wagon, a recognition that had settled the matter for him before he'd consciously decided anything at all. He didn't explain that he'd promised himself, kneeling beside his mother's bed at 14 with nothing useful to offer her but water and a cool cloth, that he would never again stand by uselessly while someone fought a fever alone if there was anything at all within his power to do about it. He'd lost his father 3 years later to an accident with a spooked horse and had run the ranch alone since he was 17, first as a boy pretending to a competence he hadn't yet earned, and then slowly as an actual rancher who'd earned every bit of the respect Pine Hollow eventually extended him. He'd never married. He judged most things in life, he'd have told you if you'd asked, by whether they could be fixed with steady enough hands and enough patience, or whether they couldn't be fixed at all regardless of effort. A rancher's arithmetic he'd learned early and never quite unlearned, and love had always struck him as belonging uncomfortably to the second category. He watched Rosalind those first 4 days with a quiet attention he didn't examine too closely. The steadiness she brought to nursing her mother despite her own exhaustion, the way she thanked him for every small kindness without once treating those kindnesses as though they were owed to her. He noticed, too, how she never once complained about the strangeness of the circumstance, the indignity of depending entirely on a stranger's charity, but simply accepted what help was offered and worked to earn her keep the moment she was physically able to. He recognized something in her that he recognized in himself, though he couldn't yet have said exactly what. The fourth night was the worst of it. Eleanor's breathing had gone shallow and labored sometime after midnight, her fever climbing past anything it had reached before, and Rosalind sat beside her mother's bed with the stillness of someone too frightened to allow herself anything else. "She's not going to make it through the night, is she?" Rosalind said, not quite a question, her eyes fixed on her mother's labored breathing. "Don't know that," Nash said honestly. "Fevers like this can turn either direction without much warning. I've seen worse turn around by morning. I've also seen it go the other way." He met her eyes directly, refusing to offer comfort dressed up as certainty. "I won't lie to you about that. Wouldn't be any kindness in it, even if it felt kinder in the moment." Rosalind nodded, something in her composure cracking slightly at the honesty of it, though she didn't cry, not yet, holding herself together with the same stubbornness her mother had shown across the whole journey west. "If she doesn't make it," Rosalind said quietly, staring at her mother's fever-flushed face, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have nobody, no family closer than Oregon, no money to reach them even if I did, no home to go back to in Ohio. I don't know what a woman does out here entirely alone." Nash didn't answer that directly, understanding there was no honest answer that would comfort her, and instead simply refilled the basin of cool water and kept working through the night alongside her, the two of them trading turns at the bedside until the sky finally began to gray toward dawn without Eleanor's condition improving or worsening any further, holding steady in the uncertain space between the two outcomes. The fever finally breaks, and a decision Rosalind never expected to make of herself is about to change the shape of everyone's life at the Whitlock Ranch. She found him at the corral 3 days later, Eleanor's fever finally beginning to ease though the danger hadn't fully passed, and asked him without any preamble she could manage after 3 sleepless days of terror the question she'd been turning over since the night she told him she had nobody left in the world. Her hands were shaking again, though this time from nerves rather than exhaustion, and she'd rehearsed the words twice on the walk out from the house without them coming out any less abruptly than they finally did. "Marry me," Rosalind said. Nash turned from the fence rail, certain he'd misheard her. "I know how that sounds," Rosalind continued before he could respond, the words coming quickly now that she'd finally forced the first one out. "I know we've known each other 4 days, and I know you've no reason to want a stranger's daughter for a wife, but I have nothing, Mr. Whitlock. No family within reach, no money, no home to return to, and if my mother doesn't recover fully, no one at all to protect either of us in a territory that doesn't offer a woman alone very many honest choices. I'm not asking because I've fallen in love with you in 4 days. I'm asking because you're the only person who's shown either of us real decency since my father died, and I'd rather build something honest with a decent stranger than gamble everything on hoping a kinder one comes along before it's too late." Nash was quiet a long moment, weighing the desperate courage it had taken her to ask against everything he understood about what a decision made in fear could cost a person later. Once the fear had passed, his eyes not leaving hers even as he chose his words with obvious care. "I won't marry a woman who's asking me out of panic," he said finally, his tone gentle but unwavering, "and then wake up in a month resenting me for saying yes to it. Your mother's fever hasn't broken yet. You haven't slept properly in 4 nights. I don't think either of us is in any state to be making a promise that's supposed to last the rest of our lives." Rosalind's face fell, humiliation flooding in behind the desperation all at once. "I'm not refusing," Nash said. "I'm asking you to let your mother's fever break first, and let yourself sleep a full night, before you decide whether what you're asking for right now is what you'll still want once the fear isn't doing the deciding for you. If it is, if you still want it once you've had a chance to think clearly, I'll marry you, and I'll mean every word of the vow when I say it. But I won't have you owe me a lifetime because you were frightened on a Tuesday and I happened to be standing nearby." "And if she doesn't recover," Rosalind said, "if I'm alone by the end of the week regardless?" "Then you'll still have a place here," Nash said. "Married or not. That much isn't conditional on anything you decide about the rest of it." Rosalind looked at him a long moment, something in his plain refusal to take advantage of her fear landing harder than any romantic declaration could have managed, the honesty of it settling into her chest in a way she hadn't expected a rejection, even a gentle one, ever could. Eleanor's fever broke 2 days later, the crisis finally passing, and though she remained weak for weeks afterward, the immediate danger had lifted enough that Rosalind could finally sleep a full night for the first time in nearly a week. Eleanor, once she was lucid enough to piece together what had happened during the worst of her fever, asked her daughter directly what exactly had passed between her and the rancher who'd nursed her back from the edge of dying. Rosalind told her the truth, embarrassed now in the clearer light of her mother's recovery, that she'd proposed marriage to a stranger out of terror, and that he'd refused to accept it until she'd had time to think clearly. "That's the wisest thing I've heard from a man in longer than I care to admit," Eleanor said, her voice still weak but her eyes sharp with the clarity of someone who'd nearly died and had opinions about what mattered because of it. "Any man willing to take a frightened woman's yes without checking first whether she meant it isn't a man worth marrying, Rosalind. This one sounds worth a second, clearer look." "I don't know what I actually want anymore," Rosalind admitted. "I asked out of fear. I don't know how much of what I felt was fear and how much was something else." "Then find out properly," Eleanor said. "You've got time now, and a roof over your head while you work it out. That's more than either of us had a week ago." Rosalind and Eleanor stayed on at the Whitlock Ranch through Eleanor's slow recovery, Rosalind taking on housework in fair exchange for their board, and found herself across the following weeks watching Nash with considerably more attention than fear or gratitude alone could account for. She noticed how patiently he explained ranch work to her when she asked, never once treating her questions as foolish, walking her through the logic of a fence line or a herd's grazing pattern with the same care he'd have given a hired hand who needed to actually understand the work rather than simply follow orders. She noticed how he'd taken to bringing Eleanor her tea each morning himself, a small kindness that cost him nothing but clearly meant something to a widow who'd spent her whole recovery believing herself a burden on a stranger's household. Eleanor noticed it too, and had considerably less restraint about saying so out loud. "That man brings me tea every single morning and has never once admitted he's doing it on purpose," Eleanor told Rosalind one afternoon, entirely too pleased with herself. "Asks if I'd like some, as though the pot simply happened to be full and he simply happened to be walking past my door at the exact hour I wake. I've raised children. I know deliberate kindness dressed up as coincidence when I see it." "Maybe he simply likes tea," Rosalind said. "Maybe," Eleanor said, arching one eyebrow. "And maybe I was born in this territory instead of Ohio." Eleanor's amusement gave way to something more serious a few evenings later, sitting on the porch and observing the two of them with the sharp attention of a woman who'd raised a daughter and buried a husband and had strong opinions about what real affection looked like versus performed courtship. "You watch him the way a woman watches a man she's decided she trusts," Eleanor told her daughter one evening, not unkindly. "That's a different thing than watching him the way a woman watches her only escape from being alone." "I'd know the difference," having done both in my own life at different times. How do you tell them apart? Rosalind asked. Trust doesn't disappear once the danger passes, Eleanor said. Escape does. Yours hasn't disappeared. I'd say that answers your own question better than I could. She paused, watching her daughter's face carefully. I was frightened when I married your father, too, if I'm honest. Different kind of fear than yours, but fear all the same. It took me the better part of a year to work out whether what I felt was love or simply relief at not being alone anymore. I'd rather you took 3 weeks to work it out than a full year, if the same choice is in front of you now. Word had spread through Pine Hollow, as word inevitably does in a town that size, about the rancher who'd taken in 2 stranded strangers, and the young woman who'd reportedly proposed to him within her first week under his roof. Not everyone in town extended the story the same generosity Eleanor had. Rosalind overheard 2 women at the mercantile speculating, not quietly enough, about what kind of woman proposed marriage to a man she'd known for days, their voices carrying easily over the shelves of canned goods between them, and felt the old humiliation rise up sharp and immediate, wondering whether the whole town now saw her as either desperate or calculating, with no room left over for any more complicated truth. She mentioned it to Nash that evening, more raw about it than she'd expected to be. Let them talk, Nash said. Town talked plenty when I ran this ranch alone for 6 years, too, speculating about why a decent-looking man with a working spread hadn't found a wife yet. Talked plenty, too, about the driver who left you and your mother stranded rather than wait out a bad cough. That story made its way through Pine Hollow inside a week, and not one person told it kindly. Man hasn't shown his face back in this county since, as far as I've heard. People fill silence with whatever story requires the least imagination. Does it make the story true? Whichever direction it points. Doesn't it bother you? Rosalind asked. Being talked about bothered me some when I was younger, Nash admitted. Learned eventually that the only opinion that actually needed satisfying was my own, and the opinion of anyone I genuinely cared what they thought of me. Everyone else's talk was just noise passing through a town too small for better entertainment. And what's your own opinion? Rosalind asked carefully, watching his face for any sign he was simply saying what he thought she wanted to hear, of the woman who proposed to you her first week here. Nash considered that seriously, the teasing gone from his voice entirely. She asked out of fear the first time, he said. And I think if she asked me again today, she wouldn't be asking out of fear anymore. She found him at the same corral 3 weeks after the first time, Eleanor strong enough now to manage an evening on her own, and asked him again, though the words came differently this time, steadier, without the desperate rush of someone racing against fear, her voice carrying the calm of a decision already fully made rather than one still being fought for. Marry me, Rosalind said again. Not because I have nowhere else to go. I could write to my cousin in Oregon tomorrow and likely still find a place there if I chose to. I'm asking because I've spent 3 weeks watching you bring my mother her tea every morning without ever once mentioning it, and because you refused my first proposal specifically to protect me from a mistake, and because I don't think I've ever in my life met a man who cared more about doing right by someone than about what that cost him personally. I love you, Nash Whitlock, entirely and without reservation. Not out of gratitude and not out of fear. I've had 3 weeks to be certain of the difference, same as you asked me to take. Nash crossed the distance between them, something in his careful composure finally breaking loose into open feeling, years of guarded caution giving way all at once. Then yes, he said, this time with his whole certainty behind it, same as hers, and not one shred of doubt left standing anywhere between them. Nash told her the whole of it himself 3 nights before the wedding, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with 2 untouched cups of coffee going cold between them. I never told you why I didn't hesitate that morning, he said, carrying your mother in. Why? It never once felt like a decision. More like something already decided long before I got there. You don't have to tell me, Rosalind said. Not if it's hard. I'd rather you heard it from me than pieced it together on your own, Nash said, and told her. His mother's fever. The 14-year-old boy kneeling helpless at her bedside with nothing but water and a cool cloth. His father too far off in the fields to reach town in time. The particular rattle in a dying woman's chest that he'd heard again 19 years later, the instant he lifted Eleanor from that overturned wagon. I promised myself, kneeling there at 14, that I'd never stand by useless again if there was anything in my power to do instead, he said. Wasn't thinking about you or your mother specifically that morning on the road. Was just doing what I'd promised a boy a long time ago I'd do if I ever got the chance. Rosalind reached across the table and took his hand, the same steady grip she'd learned from 3 weeks of nursing her own mother back from the same kind of edge. Then I'm glad you got the chance, she said, even if it took losing everything to bring us to it. They married that autumn in a small ceremony at the ranch, with Eleanor seated in a place of honor near the front, fully recovered and telling anyone who'd listen that she'd known, watching her daughter's face on the 3rd week of their stay, exactly how the story was going to end, long before either of the two people living it had figured it out themselves. Eleanor stayed on at the ranch permanently, never quite well enough for the final leg of the journey to Oregon, and by her own admission not particularly inclined to attempt it once she'd found a home worth staying in. Instead, she took over the kitchen garden the following spring, declaring the soil considerably better suited to proper vegetables than anything Ohio had ever offered her. The two women from the mercantile arrived at the wedding with a gift and a visibly rehearsed apology, stammering through something about how they hadn't meant anything unkind, only idle talk, the way Rosalind supposed most unkind talk always excused itself. Eleanor accepted their gift with a gracious smile and told them, once they'd retreated, that she gave the apology itself about 4 days before Pine Hollow found something new to gossip about, which turned out to be almost exactly right. Rosalind kept the tin cup Nash had used to give her mother water that first fever-racked night, an ordinary object with nothing remarkable about it except what it had witnessed, and told her own daughter years later, when she was old enough to ask about it, that some of the most important promises a person ever makes are the ones spoken quietly over a sick bed by someone who never once stopped to calculate what helping might cost them. Two proposals sit at the center of this story, spoken with nearly identical words 3 weeks apart. The first desperate and fear-driven, the second steady and certain. It would be easy to read the first proposal as simply wrong and the second as simply right, but that isn't quite fair to Rosalind. Fear taught her something true, even if it wasn't yet the whole truth. It taught her to recognize decency when she saw it, even exhausted and terrified, even before she'd had the luxury of examining her own feelings clearly. What changed over those 3 weeks wasn't that she discovered Nash was worth loving, she'd sensed that from the first night, watching him kneel beside her mother's bed with a tin cup of water and no expectation of thanks. What changed was that she finally had room to trust her own instinct instead of simply acting on desperate necessity, and the space to discover that the instinct and the necessity had all along been pointing toward the very same man. Nash's refusal is the real hinge of this story, a man turning down exactly what he wanted because he wanted it honestly rather than out of someone else's panic. It would have cost him nothing in the moment to simply say yes to a frightened woman's offer. It cost him considerably more, in a quieter way, to say not yet and mean it, and to trust that the waiting itself might be the very thing that made the eventual yes worth having. And Eleanor, recovering in a stranger's house with nothing left of her old life but her daughter and a single trunk of belongings, still found the clarity to tell her own child the difference between trust and escape. A distinction most of us spend a lifetime failing to draw clearly, let alone from a sick bed 3 days after nearly dying of it ourselves.